And then, yeah, happy to hand straight over to you, Shmueli.
Okay, I will share my screen. Can you enable?
Do I need to make you co-host?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. That should be done.
Try that again. Yes. Okay. I'm assuming you can see.
Yeah.
You see the Macaros?
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first, good evening. Thank you everyone for making time on a weeknight to sit and learn Torah with me. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm only sorry that the shul are scraping the bottom of the barrel to find people to speak. Before I start, as a brief note about the learning that we do tonight together to be in the Sukkos of Diana and Troy, who's on Chanukah ben Blimina, and with that, we will crack on. So, as hopefully you can all see from my screen, that I've titled the Shir Chanukah Sukkos in Kislev. I'll give a very brief introduction as to what this means. And the basis is, I think, quite well known. Chanukah is the latest festival that we really keep in Judaism in terms of the calendar, in terms of the time in history. It's right at the end of what we call the Common Era, in the sort of last couple of hundred years. And as such, it has some features that are not present in the other Yom Tovim that are interesting, and particularly when viewed with a lens of the themes that occur within it, and with the mitzvos, and with the story. I think that it proves a very interesting story and very different to how we traditionally look at Yom Tovim. In order to do, I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which is you'll see on the shorty, a very brief introduction into the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha, or as Chazal referred to them as Sefer Sfarim HaChitzonim, I'm not going to go into in any great detail, simply because it's far larger than the time allocated. What I will say is I'll shamelessly plug next week's speaker in this slot, Mr. Lebret, who is speaking exactly on this point on the Apocrypha in Orthodox thought, which is without question a far more interesting topic than mine. So I'm sorry you have to wait a week to hear him. But just as a very, very brief introduction to what is the Apocrypha or the Sfarim HaChitzonim, and it's important to understanding how we get the story of Hanukkah. It's quite well known that Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah, is brought in Daf Chaf Aleph on a base in Masechah Shabbos, so it comes up in the Gemara, but it's very sparse in terms of references to Hanukkah in the Gemara, possibly because of how long into the codification of the Gemara that the story of Hanukkah occurred. It was very, very late on. So what I will very briefly say is that once Chazal had decided what was counted in the 24 Sfarim of Nach, the Nevi'im and Kesuvim, there were other Sfarim that existed in sort of the Jewish world that were deemed, for various reasons, not to be sort of fitting, but they existed and they were genuine. There are 13 primary Sfarim HaChitzonim, Sfarim that call things like Sefer Yehudis, about the famous story of Yehudis that we all know, of Yehudis going into the camp of the besieging general and decapitating him. These are stories that come from the Sfarim HaChitzonim. Why are they relevant to this? And that's because part of the Sfarim HaChitzonim is a book called Sefer HaMakkabim. Sefer HaMakkabim is a book that was probably originally written in Hebrew, but the earliest versions we can find are Greek. So translated from the Hebrew into Greek, and then it's been translated back into Hebrew. There are 4 Sfarim HaMakkabim. The academics who've looked into this topic in far more greater depth than I have suggest that the first Sefer HaMakkabim is the most authentic. And what basically happened when you see here development of the narrative, what basically seems to have occurred is the themes that occur in the Hanukkah story, so good over bad, and religious zeal, with some other themes that develop in some other stories that became part of what we call the Hanukkah story. So the very famous story that Gemara in Gittin, Daf and Zion brings down about Hannah and her 7 sons who die al Kiddush Hashem because they're forced to eat non-kosher. That story is quoted in the Gemara, but it is quoted also in the letter Maccabee, Sfarim HaMakkabim. So there's a bit of tumult about exactly which of these books are most authentic or just authentic in the first place. What I've done to give a very brief into this, and this I'm going down to the source sheets, is brought from Sefer Maccabim Aleph, the first Sefer Maccabim, and highlighted here in red, but I've got below the English translation just for the sake of ease. And what it records is that on the 25th of the ninth month being from Nisan, which is Kislev, that's when the Bnei Israel sacrificed on the new altar, so there's a Chanukah HaMizbeach, which is of course a thing, something that we are well aware of, that the Kohanim who were part of the Maccabean revolt restored the temple, and the Machanech, they re-inaugurated the Mizbeach, and that was part of the celebration of Hanukkah, and they kept for 8 days, etc., etc. This story is all well known. I then brought something else from the second Sefer HaMaccabim, and this is really the earliest explicit reference to a connection between Chanukah and Sukkos. As you can see here, it says, you will celebrate this being Sefer Chanukah like Sukkos. And then it goes on to describe Nehemiah, which we'll see later on. But of course, Nehemiah, or in Sefer Nehemiah, there is discussion of, again, the Bnei Israel celebrating Sukkos with fervor, and again, later on in the year, we'll return to that. But you can see here that these Sfarim HaMaccabim are, again, a slightly later source. It's in the same Sefer that they kept Hanukkah in the same way. They kept it Kimei Chaka Sukkos. And it says here, Pasuk Yud, here the 10th Pasuk, V'kochu Arvei Nochav HaKavos Tumorim. So that sounds like part of the service of the first inaugural Hanukkah did actually involve Arba Minim. This is, I think it's quite well known. There is a connection that, and there is an idea that in the year of the revolt and of the war, the Bnei Israel were not able to celebrate Sukkot at Sukkot time, so they did so at the earliest possible opportunity, which was Hanukkah. The rather cheaply titled Apocrypha or Apocrypho, there are two primary sources in the Gemara discussing these Sfarim HaChitzonim, this Apocrypha, this body of works. The first is the Gemara in Baba Kama, which is going through a list of sources, and it's asking where these psukim come from. And so one of these psukim here about palm trees strolls and goes through along a grove of barren trees. Where's this come from? And the Ramari says this comes from Nevi'im, and it's also written in Kisuvim. Where's it written in Kisuvim? So straight away Tosfos responds on this Gemara and on this Babashilish Kisuvim, and he says explicitly, this posuk that is talking about the references does not occur anywhere in the Tanakh. Sefer Ben Sirahu, and so Sefer Ben Sira is one of the apocryphal books. I will not go into detail on that, but Sefer Ben Sira is one of the more authentic, as it were, of the apocryphal books. And then he brings another posuk and says this other posuk is also from Ben Sira. And the point it's making is that even though the Gemara is asking for sources in Tanakh for Pesukim, that actually some of the sources are not in Tanakh, they are Sfarim HaChitzonim. This brings us on to another Gemara in Sanhedrin in Perach Chelek right at the end. And again, it says, Akiva says here, Sfarim HaChitzonim. This is the Apocrypha. It says, a person who does so they lose their share in the world to come. What does that mean? It's a whole subject for a different share in itself. But the understanding is, so Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Sefer Ben Sira, Nami Osin Nikre, that all these from the Apocrypha, they are forbidden to be read. And why are they forbidden? And the Gemara poses a suggestion, maybe it's because the content of the Pesukim doesn't make sense. Here is about the idea of flaying the skin of a fish and wasting some of the fish, and that would be like Bal Tashchis, and therefore it's just not. It can't be that the Torah would advocate for doing something that would be Bal Tashchis, but actually that's not what we say. We say that's not the reason for it being forbidden. And on this, Rashi says here straight away, Rabbi Yosef after Sefer Ben Sira, what's the issue with this Sefer Ben Sira? It has words that are Havai, it can be translated, I suppose, as embellished, I think. And the stories that contain within it can lead a person astray and end up to just wasting time that should be spent learning, as it were, real Torah in inverted commas. Rashi is not a fan of Ben Sira. And to extrapolate that further, there on the daf references this the Mishnah Torah, the works of the Rambam, in Sefer Mada, where he's talking about Hilchos Avodah Zarah, and in the second perek he says that there are lots of Sforim that are written by Ovdei that either versions write loads of books, and they're all very interesting, but they're not for us, and we don't read them. And the inference is that the Rambam would suggest that these books contained in the Apocrypha are possibly contained within the Issa of reading Avodah Zarah or learning about the practices of Avodah Zarah, which the Rambam suggests is probably not a job for a nice Jewish boy or girl, not basically. So that's the end of my introduction to the Apocrypha. As I said, next week, 9 p.m, same time, same place, you'll find a much better elucidation on this than you'll get from me. But that's the basic background. So the story of the Chanukah story is very late on, probably as the stories of the Gemara are being finished. And so it's important to get the narrative right, what is authentically part of the narrative. And there are lots of different sources that from tributaries to the narrative. And that in itself is unique among Sforim. There is, I should note, a book that I referenced earlier in the source sheets called Megillas Antiochus. So Megillas Antiochus is referenced in a sefer called Megillas Tanios, which is a very ancient sefer that we have, which lists a set of very important days in the Jewish calendar and the reasons for doing so. So there's Yom Nikanor. There's all sorts of interesting days that we don't keep anymore. And in Megillas Antiochus, in Megillas Tanios, it references Megillas Antiochus, which is a much later recounting of the whole story of Chanukah, which sounds like it's much more authentic, but it's much later on. So it's a compilation, a retrospective compilation, rather than sort of live news reporting, as it were, in biblical times. Okay, so section 2. So now the interesting thing I wanted to come on to is the connection between the halachas of Sukkos married to the halachas of Chanukah. And the first thing I wanted to discuss, and I brought here in source number 15, and the question I pose is, unusually for halachic Sforim or halachis, when they write about Yom Tovim, they don't tend to start with an introduction in the actual body of the halachic word. They might have a hakdama, an introduction to the book, but they don't begin discussing Hilchos Pesach with the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. They don't begin the story of. They don't discuss, the halachas of Sukkos with the story of Sukkos. But with Chanukah, almost ubiquitously, all of the major Rishonim and Acharonim do exactly this. They go into quite long detail. The reason I brought the Aruch HaShulchan, this is of Yechiel Mechel Epstein, who was a contemporary of the Mishnah Berurah, lived in the late 19th, early 20th century, and wrote his halachic codex on the whole of Shulchan Aruch. It's an amazing breadth of work. And what he has written here, and you'll see, I'm not going to go through each word, but you can see it's an extraordinarily long introduction on the whole story of Chanukah. And the bits that I've highlighted in red are specifically interesting bits that you wouldn't necessarily have thought needed to be highlighted or needed to be emphasized in a work as recent as the Aruch HaShulchan, but even still, the victory was not a natural victory. I think this is quite known. The Chashanim were basically, what we would call Gedolei Hador. They were used to sitting down and learning Torah. They certainly weren't used to attacking hordes of Greek soldiers. And it goes through, and it says here, he came with a lot of soldiers and with elephants. It really goes on and gives the whole story about exactly what happened. And then, of course, the Jews won. So that's the first interesting bit to highlight. And then the interesting, so clearly the Aruch HaShulchan is saying here that the primary victory, the primary nace, is the military victory. And then he says in the second line, so the 25th was when that nace finished. And then the next line is a second nace occurred, which is the nace of the Pach Shemen, the nace of the jug of oil. And there is a machlokes in some of the Rishonim as to which of the nisim is the nace we're talking about. Aruch HaShulchan clearly wants to suggest that there are two nisim. I don't think he's on his own in that regard. But again, you can see here that all these text is all his introductions specifically on the Yom Tov Chanukah, and it's extremely long and it's extremely detailed. You could suggest the reason for this is because we want to ensure that there is an undisputed body of halachic work, an authentic recounting of the story of Chanukah in detail, and the narrative is controlled certainly from Jewish writings. If you look at Sefer HaMaccabim, to go back to what we talked about before, certainly books 4 and 3, but also potentially 2, the literary style, for those who are holding a literary style of Greek biblical literature, is very much in the Greek style, not in the Hebrew style. There's lots of metaphor, there's lots of human struggle, there's lots of emotion in there. And of course, these are not necessarily things that we particularly are used to seeing in Tanakh. They're not absent from Tanakh, but they're not sort of Platonic references in the Greek sense. So the point is that Chazal have clearly decided it's extremely important to recount the story accurately. And again, I'm going to keep going on just to show the length. This is just, so far, it's not talking about any halachas at all. But then again, this bit is interesting here. So the Fisha Alideham says, Bitlu Azmin Sukkos Ha'avar. Because of the burden of the persecution of the Greeks, they were unable to keep Sukkot, as we discussed earlier, and of course not Shmini Atzeres either the following day. As a reminder of their inability to keep Sukkot that year. Also, Chanukah, they made 8 days of Chanukah. Straight away, we've seen this parallelism, the 8 days of Sukkot with the 8 days of Chanukah. Which is interesting, because of course that means that maybe the Aruch Shulchan is suggesting that the nace of the Pach Shemen is not necessarily that it lasted 8 nights. That's always what we learn in school: 8 nights, 8 days. But of course, the Shulchan Aruch is suggesting the reason for the 8 days is nothing to do with the nace of Pach Shemen. It's to do with the fact that the Sukkot didn't happen, and so therefore they had 8 days. And then. Yes, so the penultimate line of that highlighted text, they saw after that Hashem agreed that they would institute this celebration. So do 8 days. So right at the end, he references the fact that the oil lasted 8 days. But I would go so far as to suggest that it's almost convenient, lahavdil, that the 8 days, that the nace of the Pach Shemen was also 8 days, because it sounds like there was already a plan to keep an 8-day festival to account for Sukkot. Now, of course, in halachic terms, there's a whole different discussion about what it means that you miss a Yom Tov, and then several weeks or months later, you make up for it by keeping a sort of pseudo Yom Tov. This is, again, far outside the realms of this discussion, but I just wanted to put it out there. Again, these are features that are unique to Chanukah in the Jewish calendar. Okay, so I'm going to come through and just finish off this introduction of the Aruch HaShulchan. One thing I thought I'd highlight, which is interesting from the Aruch HaShulchan, that the last line of his introduction, he's talking about the things that we do on Chanukah. We have there might not be a mitzvah, a Sudas mitzvah to have a genuine kind of Yom Tov meal, but it might be a nice idea to have a slight, to slightly embellish what other might be a bland dinner of pasta. People that play cards on Chanukah. Unshim Rav, people that play cards on Chanukah and waste your time playing silly ball games, they're in big trouble. When I was saying how Robin this passion negat Taras as Israel, there's a big concern that this minhag of playing games on Chanukah is now rampant and is bad news. So I don't know what he's referring to. I did see in Encyclopedia Judaica a suggestion that dreidel, which of course we learn in school, is the ancient excuse the Bnei Israel gave when they were learning Torah in the caves during the ban on learning from the Greeks. And when the Greeks walk in, they would sort of hide their Gemaras and pull out a dreidel. And if we have time at the end, I might come back to a very interesting story about that, which might well put you off playing dreidel, or certainly ruin the fun of the story. So I'll keep that to the end, see if anyone's still listening. Okay, so that's the Aruch HaShulchan. And again, the point is that already there's a very clear link between Sukkot and Chanukah being some sort of makeup for Sukkah. The next section of the shir, which again is continuing this connection between Sukkot and Chanukah, comes from a shir from Rav Meir Goldzich, one of the Rosh Yeshiva of YU. So he's brought here 3 or 4 very interesting ideas. The first, of course, is that Ner Chanukah, the mitzvah, is to light facing outside, or of course in Eretz Yisrael or other places, light actually outside, which of course is not dissimilar to Sukkot, which is a mitzvah that we do outdoors. Again, 8 days we've discussed, but of course there 2 are there. Was obviously in the Torah when in what we call Parshas Hamoadim, which is when the Torah goes through all the different Yom Tovim, right immediately after that we have the Torah talking about Halakas HaMenorah. So there's a connection in terms of placement between the end of the Sfarim Hamoadim, which culminate with Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, straight away with the story of lighting the menorah, and that could be seen as an intrinsic connection, or certainly a source for the connection. The last interesting halacha which comes up for Chanukah and is well known is that a Chanukah gvur meshim amos psula. As somebody you can't have a menorah that's higher than 20 amos because the eye doesn't naturally sort of see things that are that high up. And of course, the same din is true with the roof of a sukkah. We know that a sukkah can't be higher than 20 amos for the same reason that the shelter ba'ena that one doesn't naturally see things that are that high up. So again, an interesting connection between details of the mitzvahs of Sukkos and those of Chanukah. There is, however, another layer of this of Goldfish wanted to extract, which is about emunah. And if you look at emunah, there are three. You could argue that at a very, very high level, there are three primary ideas in emunah. The first is talking about hashgacha pratis, the idea that Hakadosh Baruch Hu has direct influence on each of our lives, and he's running the show directly rather than being sort of aloof and letting the world run by itself. The second is the Torah min hashamayim, that we believe we have a strong belief that the Torah is authentic, came from Hakadosh Baruch Hu. V'zos Torah asher son Moshe. This is the real deal. And the third is ein od milvado, the idea that we believe in Hakadosh Baruch Hu and there is no other interceding forces, that everything begins and ends with Hashem. There's nothing in between. So why are these things connected to Chanukah and Sukkot? So you can see here there are three psukim that are brought out in the Torah that discuss it. The first is reference, and all these three psukim talk about emunah in the same context of talking about Klal Yisrael. There are three psukim in Torah, or three times in Torah, where Bnei Yisrael are referenced explicitly with regards to emunah. The first is Moshe Rabbeinu when he gets chosen for the task of representing Bnei Yisrael to Paro in the story of the Exodus. He says, the Bnei Yisrael will not believe in me, they won't take me seriously. That's the first, and that's talking about hashgacha pratis, that Moshe, that's, they won't, that Hashem is directly involved in everybody's life. That was a moment of a doubt, as it were, in that, or concern. The second is a pasuk made later on also in the book of Shemos, which is the story of just after Bnei Yisrael have left Mitzrayim and they get to the Yam Suf, and they cross the Yam Suf, and they killed all the Mitzri, the cavalry, the Egyptian cavalry, which comes after them. But Yahweh saw Hashem, and they shall saw Hashem, Hashem of Moshe after. And at that point, they had emunah in Hashem. So what's that? What was emunah in? They've just seen the 10 Makkos, they've seen the Ascent of Triumph, they've seen the Yam Suf. Ein od milvado. In that moment is an epiphany of that there's nothing out in this world that's not happening other than according to the direct interjection of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And the third passage again from Shemos is talking about much later Torah min hashamayim, the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu goes up Har Sinai to receive the luchos, and then it says Gam b'cha ya'aminu le'olam, and also in you says that Hashem says to Moshe that they'll believe in this Torah that you're going to bring down from me. They'll believe in it. They'll believe in Torah min hashamayim. So each of these, in the writings, this is now quoting from the Maharal, each of these three aspects of emunah has a link to a Yom Tov. Pesach is ein od milvado, as we saw before from the quote from the Kriyas Yom Tov. It's an undeniable representation of Hashem's uniqueness and his complete omnipresence in the world. Shavuos is, of course, Torah min hashamayim. It's Matan Torah Seinu. And the third is Sukkos hashgacha pratis, that Bnei Yisrael lived in the Midbar. They had the Ananei HaKavod, and they had the Man, and they had the Slav, and they had the Be'er Miriam, all these things that Hashem sustained Bnei Yisrael in their travels in the Midbar, which of course is when the reason why we have Sukkos, Sukkos and Shatis Bnei Yisrael, that the Bnei Yisrael lived in Sukkos during their travails in the desert, and therefore Bnei Yisrael, this was a training camp to have emunah and hashgacha pratis, that Hashem is directly sort of looking after all of us individually and collectively. A very nice idea that the regolim, why are they called the regolim? We know that because they're aliyah l'rega, but the Mara wants to say that the regolim are like raglayim, that the legs of emunah, that these Yom Tovim are the legs on which Yada stands, and the strong foundation which it stands, because it's reg to emunah. So then, of course, you've got a problem, and that's only the regolim. What about the other Yom Tovim? What about Purim and Chanukah? Well, Purim is easy to find connections with, because obviously Torah min hashamayim, we know that in the story of the Purim story, that we have an idea that the Bnei Yisrael re-accepted the Torah, or they accepted Torah Sheba'al Peh in the time of the Purim story. So that easily addresses that. And of course, you've got the idea of ein od milvado. The whole Purim story is about that, even if the world seems to have its own natural course, and Haman happened to be in charge, and all those things happen. Ein od milvado. Hashem still is running the show, and you can be totally reliant on Hashem to run the world in his own way, even if it appears to be entirely sort of by happenstance. Of course, we know it isn't. So therefore, there's a gap. So what gap does the Chanukah fill? Chanukah also fills Hashgacha Pratis, that the Bnei Yisrael, the Maccabim, the Kohanim, the family of Yochanan, were all felt directly that they had to fight what was seemingly an impossible battle against the Yavonim, and the Hashem has Hashgacha Pratis, and he looked after their individual needs and find the Pach Hashem, and these are things that show that Hashem is directly overseeing the world. So again, Chanukah is a celebration or as it's a manifestation of this emunah in Hashgacha Pratis, in the same way that Sukkos is as well. So another connection between the two. There's a you'll see here, source 27 is a Mishnah in the 5th Perek of Sukkah, which describes the festivities at the Simchas Beis HaShareva, which we knew was quite a party. And we know that there was a machlokas as to how many torches they juggled, whether there's one person juggling 8 or there are 2 people juggling 4. But the point is that Rav Goldvich suggested, while either way, 2 sets of 4 or 1 set of 8, there were 8 torches being hurled around on Sukkot. If we're talking about connections with Chanukah and Sukkot, then 8 torches is rather coincidental, you might suggest, as a connection to Chanukah and Sukkot. Now we're moving towards this connection, this very deep connection that we see in Chanukah. We know why is Chanukah because it was Chanukah on the 25th of the month. They re-established the Mizbeach, they re-anointed the Mizbeach and sort of resumed temple service. Here's a positive Chagai. So Chagai, the Novi, says that for the 24th day of the 9th month, which is Erev Chanukah, that this is the time that Hashem's the time that, whatever this means, the foundation that was laid for Hashem's temple. So we can see from the Novi that this time of year is auspicious for the establishing of Beis Hamikdash, Mishkan, Avodah. It's very clear. Says Rashi on that pasuk, that this is the time of year when, in the time of Koresh, that they began to build the foundations for the temple. And now we move on to a slightly more obvious, explicit connection between Chanukah and Sukkot. So in the Gemara in Shabbos we referenced earlier about what the sort of the story of Chanukah and the practice of Chanukah. So there's a machlokas in the Gemara as to whether we light 1 candle on the first day and 8 on the last, or 8 on the first day and 1 on the last. Do we go up or do we go down? There are reasons given for each. The first reason for going up is Malim B'Kodesh. We have an idea that we always go up in matters of holiness. We don't ever want to decrease. But then the opposing view is brought. Can I get Parei Hachag? The Parei Hachag, which refers to on Sukkot, the special temple avodah. One of the special unique aspects of the avodah on Sukkot was that in the base of which is 70 Carbonus Musaf were offered over Sukkot, and these 70 bulls that were offered were connected, was a kapara, as it were, an atonement for the 70 Ummas Ha'olam, for the 70 nations of the world, that they too could achieve atonement just after Yom Kippur. We achieve atonement on Yom Kippur, and then we celebrate with Sukkot, and so too we offer these 70 bulls over the course of the Yom Tov to celebrate. So the obvious question is, okay, that's a good example of something going down in numbers in the Jewish world, but is there a more intrinsic and more perhaps deep connection between Parei HaChag and Chanukah? And we're going to see hopefully that there is. We have a principle that whenever Chazal make a takana, or they make a geder, or they bring a mitzvah, they bring a ruling d'Rabbanan, they do it ka'ein deraisa tikkun. And when they make a takana, they try to model it on some tikkun deraisa. They try to model it on a theme or on a mitzvah in the Torah to keep it as authentic, in line with Torah Bichsav, I should say. So how is Parei HaChag, based on that principle that everything they do is modeling? How is Parei HaChag ka'ein? How is mitzvah of Ner Chanukah ka'ein? How is it representative of Parei HaChag? So as I said before, each day of Sukkos, a different combination of karbonos was offered in descending order of cows to total 70. And we have a rule in Hallel. So what does them occur? What is the source for saying Hallel on Yom Tov? And initially it comes in the Avodah, that when the Kohanim were doing the Korban Musaf, that the Leviim sang Shira, and they blew the Chatzotos, they blew the trumpets. And in the same way they blew the trumpets, said from then on, because the Leviim were singing Shira. So we say Hallel on days we're often Korban Musaf, which is why on Pesach, one of the reasons that on Pesach, on the first day of Pesach, we say full Hallel, but afterwards we do not. Interestingly, on Sukkos, we finish Hallel the whole way through Yom Tov. So why is it that on Sukkos we do and Pesach we don't? So one suggestion would be, based on this connection of Parei HaChag, that the Hallel is connected to the Musaf. On Pesach, there's one Korban Musaf offered each day of Pesach. It's the same structure of the Korbanos, whereas Sukkos is not the case. Sukkos, you start on day one with 13 korbanos, and you gradually reduce throughout the day. So each day of Sukkot has a different combination of korbanos, and therefore a different korban musaf, and therefore its own unique requirement to say Hallel. And of course, on Chanukah, we say Hallel, the full Hallel, on each of the 8 days. So there's another element of parallelism, in the same way that on Sukkot, where there's a unique combination of the korban musaf, and that triggers the Hallel. So to on Chanukah, we have a different combination of light lit every night, from 1 up to 8. So too, we say Hallel on each day, and each day therefore retains some uniqueness, which plays into, which potentially is alluded to by those Chazal and Rishonim Achronim who suggest that actually the Nes Chanukah in terms of Pach HaShemen, how many Nisim were there? Was it one Nes that they had enough of one day lit for 8? Or was it the fact that 1 day's worth kept alight for 8 days? Was that 8 separate Nisim? It's a discussion in the post-argument, not for now, but certainly there is a connection between there. Going to come down through here. We just want the carbon sofa. Okay, so Nehemiah. So now we're going to Nehemiah. So they asked to, this is source number 37 on your source sheets. We asked you Chol Hakol Hashavim and Hashvi. So all of the immigrants, the captives, or the who returned. Sukkos ve'eshu b'sukkos kilo also b'mei Yeshua ben Nun came b'nei Yisrael ad hayamahu. They never had a sukkos like it since today's Yeshua ben Nun. They never had a sukkos like it, and there was great rejoicing. So the question is, why was there? Okay, so I understand they couldn't do sukkos. It is probably not unreasonable to suggest that they couldn't do sukkos. They possibly couldn't do other Yom Tov. They possibly couldn't do Yom Kippur, or Rosh Hashanah, or Pesach, or Shavuos. But that's not alluded to. But the question is, why? This connection that they kept sukkos, and why was it the best sukkos for an extraordinarily long time? And the suggestion is actually going to be now a connection between the spiritual victory of Chanukah story and its connection to Sukkos. And this is related to this is connected to the idea of the Avodah Zarah, the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, and the overcoming of Bnei Yisrael of this Yetzer Hara. So what happened in the original Sukkot, the first Sukkot? So there's a famous Vilna Gaon who asked, why do we celebrate Sukkot on Sukkot? So it makes sense, the reasons for Sukkot, but why the time in the calendar? If anything, the Sukkot that we lived in were right in the Yetziat Mitzrayim, which was Pesach time. So we should celebrate the fact that we lived in Sukkot at Pesach time. Why Sukkot? And the Gra brings that Sukkot is the date on which the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory that protected and encased the Bnei Yisrael on their travels to the Midbar, they were removed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu after the sin of the Chet HaEgel. The Chet HaEgel happened, and as a punishment for the Chet HaEgel, the Ananei HaKavod were removed. So what then happened is, we know the famous story, Moshe goes out and davens to Bnei Yisrael, and they have the first Yom Kippur, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Shlach Kivarecha, I forgive you for the Chet HaEgel. And then on the 15th of Tishrei, the Anei HaKavod returned to Bnei Yisrael. And so says the Gra, this is why we celebrate Sukkot on this day, to commemorate, because Sukkot is also, as the Gemara says in Masech Sukkot, describing the source for it, is it Sukkot Mamish, or we're celebrating actual physical booths, or the Anei HaKavod. And so the Gra explains that's why there's a connection to the Anei HaKavod and Sukkot. So in that story, of course, what's really happened is Bnei Yisrael have fallen foul of Avodah Zarah. They've gone to worship the Egel Hazav, and therefore Hashem's Shechina, in some respect, is removed. He removes his hashgacha. He removes the Ananei HaKavod B'nai Yisrael and says, right, you're on your own. That's how you want to play it. That's how you play it. That's fine. But then the B'nai Yisrael daven, they get mechila, and it returns. And that's a sort of celebration on Sukkos. Chanukah has a similar theme. If you imagine the context of the story of Hanukkah, so Hellenism is sweeping across the ancient Near East, and many of the Sforim at great pains to describe that many of the Bnei Israel had fallen foul to the Hellenistic culture, which of course we can't be too upset about because a great deal of that is retained in our own modern culture. But certainly it sounds like the parts of the culture they embraced were not necessarily studying A-level maths. It was about Avodah Zarah and paganism, and they certainly weren't keeping to the rules of the Torah. And so the Hanukkah story occurs. The Bnei Israel win this seemingly physical victory over the Greeks who are trying to oppress them spiritually. They overcome this Yetzer Hara as a people to perform Avodah Zarah. And what happens straight away afterwards? Chanukah Mizbeach, the Bnei Israel, they are zochet to go back into the Beis HaMikdash, which the Greeks have ransacked, and they restore it, and they resume the temple service. So and of course what happens then is the Shechina, where the Shechina lives, is the Beis HaMikdash. So in the same way that the Bnei Israel have had this return of the Shechina to them in the Ananei HaKavod at Sukkos, we see a very similar idea expressed in the Hanukkah story, that the Bnei Israel have done tshuva, as it were, by fighting for their spirituality, for their mitzvahs and their Torah, and the result of which is they beat the Greeks, they restore the Beis HaMikdash, and the Shechina returns. So there's an element of parallelism, and that perhaps is why the story we just read in that the Gemara Erchin quotes about Nehemiah, that they had a Sukkos then, unlike any Sukkos since before Yeshua ben Nun. What was happening at that time? Well, this is the time in Jewish history where we have a Maseres from Chazal that the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah dissipated, and from that point on, the Bnei Israel no longer had a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, whatever that means. I'm getting to the sort of the depth of that in its entirety. Certainly not the time or the place, but the idea is that in that year, once the Jewish people had overcome this great desire for Avodah Zarah, that's what do they celebrate with extra gusto? They celebrated Sukkos. Sukkos was the Yom Tov they chose to celebrate with great zeal, and we could potentially understand that in reference to the Ananei HaKavod, the Shechina coming back as a result of Avodah Zarah, or going off the path, to put it in sort of loose terms. Okay, so now we see a Gemara in Shabbos, again in the area we're discussing the Karbonos. So it's a question of the menorah and discussion of the menorah in Parshas Ba'aloscha in the beginning of Bamidbar. So it says, so outside the parachas, outside the curtain, that's where the menorah was lit. So the question is, why did what is the point of the menorah? Says the Gemara. Says here, the lighting of the menorah is Eidus to Kol Boy Olam, that the Shechina is Shara B'Yisrael. The menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, what was its purpose? Its purpose was to represent to the whole world that the Shechina rests among Bnei Israel. That's what the Gemara in Shabbos tells us. That the menorah is the symbol of Hashras HaShechina. The menorah is a symbol that Hashem is with us, quite literally. He's present in our world. So you could ask why the menorah and not any of the other kelim in the Beis HaMikdash would be used to represent this, but of course, based on the theme that we've been developing, it makes perfect sense that the menorah would be the symbol of Hashras HaShechina, of the residing of Hashem's presence in this world, because we know that the Hanukkah, and of course the menorah we're talking about, the Beis HaMikdash, is not the same menorah that we light, of course, but thematically, that the idea that the menorah represents the Shechina certainly ties in very nicely with the Hanukkah story and with the theme we've just developed about the Shechina existing as a result of overcoming communal abandonment of Torah mitzvahs for the sake of Avodah Zarah. Okay, so that brings us really to the end of the Makoros. What I wanted to end with is that I appreciate there's a lot of sources to run through here. So I'm very happy to have questions for anybody at the end who has any. But the idea I wanted to try and bring out to recap is that we see that there are three areas of connection between Chanukah and Sukkos. The first is, you could argue, is a historical connection in terms of Chanukah being a delayed celebration of Sukkos, and the reasons for which, again, are we can look into another time. But the juncture on which Bnei Israel celebrated that delayed Sukkos was Hanukkah, and it did so, and there was the same number of days. And again, the ideas we discussed about that being outside. We brought the famous Vilna Gaon about the return of the Shekhinah to Bnei Israel being at the same time as Sukkah, being the time of Sukkos, and we talked about how the connection also between the returning of the Shekhinah to the Chashim Noim after their conquest of the Greeks in this period right before the Bar Kokhba revolt. We also talked about the connection in terms of Emunah, the three aspects of Emunah, and how Hashgacha Pratis is the theme of Emunah that is manifest, according to the writings of the Maharal, in Sukkot of the Regolim and Chanukah of the later Yomim Tovim. And Hashgacha Pratis is, of course, present in both the reasons we discussed. But fundamentally, there is a very strong theme in terms of the Avodah, the Beis HaMikdash, the returning of the Avodah, the representation of the Korban Musaf at the time of the Pari HaChag, and how that is exactly the same example that Chazal used to explain why we light the menorah that we do, and why we descend in order rather than. Oh, sorry, that's the suggestion as to why we would descend. Of course, I should say that we don't descend; we go from 1 to 8, as I think is well known. But the connections, I think, are very strong. What we do with this information, I think, certainly for me, it gives me a renewed understanding of the theme of Hanukkah being very much about renewal of practices that were really at the end of their time. You know, as I said, 30 years after the Hanukkah story nominally is the Bar Kokhba revolts and really we're heading towards Churban Habayis and the end of the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Which of course we're still living in today. So that Hanukkah has such strong links to Chanukah HaMizbeach, to a renewal of the Beis HaMikdash, to a renewal of the Avodah, is extremely, I think, poignant. I wanted to touch on an idea from a Rav called Eli Baruch Shulman, who is Rosh Yeshiva again in YU. He's also one of the editors of the article Shas, a big time Chacham. He runs a shul in Manhattan or Brooklyn, as far as I'm aware. I had an idea from him that talking about the connection between, again, Hanukkah and Sukkos. So we know, as I said before, that there's a din in Hallel, and so there's a Maseches Sofrim. So Maseches Sofrim, which is one of the Masechtas Ketanas, one of the sort of the smaller Masechtas in Shas that are often bundled together. One of the Mishnayos in Maseches Sofrim tells us that there is a minhag that we know quite well, that some people stay in shul on the first night Pesach and they say Hallel. So this is a minhag, but a minhag is brought explicitly in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says explicitly that there is a minhag to stay in shul on the first night of Pesach and to read Hallel. Why? Is a kiyum of the pasuk in the Roma Shemo Yachtov. The people should get together. They should say Hallel together on the first night. Why? In the Roma Shemo Yachtov, to exalt Hashem's name together in biyachad as a unit. Okay. In itself, that's very nice. We also have a separate din in Hallel. That Hallel, we have a din, it's supposed to say Hallel b'ne'ima. Hallel is supposed to be said pleasantly. It's not supposed to be mumbled, as it often sadly is. It's not supposed to be done in 20 seconds. It's supposed to be done b'ne'ima. So we know about on Purim, the Gemara tells us that on Purim, why do we say Hallel on Purim? Because Megillah zu Halila, the Megillah Esther acts in some way as the Hallel on Purim. But seeing as on Hanukkah, we actually do Hallel. We actually do say Hallel. So we also have this din of Ne'ima. So says Rav Shulman, in the same way that Hallel has a din of Ne'ima, that one should do Hallel pleasantly, you could argue then that Hallel is about exalting Hashem's name. You could equate that with Pursum Hanes. You could equate that with publicizing the miracles of the Hanukkah story. And in that case, how does one do a mitzvah like Pirsum Hanes in the Hanukkah setting, b'ne'ima, how do it pleasantly? Says Rav Shulman, with Hiddur. We do with extra Hiddurim. And we know, of course, that the story with lighting of the menorah, that we have 2 levels of Hiddur. We have Mahadrin, and then we have Mahadrim and Mahadrim, which is unusual for mitzvahs to have multiple levels of Hiddur explicitly expressed, even as early as the Gemara. What's the idea behind this? Says Rav Shulman, it's a connection in the Ne'ima. that because the lighting of candles, you could say, is thematically linked to Nrom Mashmer Yachtov, that we're expressing in a very explicit way the greatness of Hashem and the miracle of the Chanukah story. We do so with extra Hiddur, in the same way that we try to say Halal with extra Ne'ima. We try to say Halal, we try to light the candles with extra Ne'ima. How do you light with Ne'ima? You can say you can light with oil, yes, true, but the idea is that you light with Hiddur, and everyone lights their own menorah for the Hiddurim that we know clearly. And again, that ties us very nicely back to the idea of the Korban and Musaf on Sukkos, which of course were accompanied by Hallel. So thematically, we kind of close the loop. We have this Hallel, Musaf, Person Hanes, the Roma Shmer Yachtov. The idea that Chanukah is for us an opportunity to to exalt Hashem in a very public forum in a way that we're not really used to, sort of taking the game to the opposition, as it were, and showing the world the beauty of Hashem's mitzvos, the beauty of emunah, the beauty of keeping the Torah and investing in it. I've now come to the end of my makoros. If anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. But otherwise, I thank you all very much for tuning in.
You teased us with the potential to put us off playing dreidel.
Oh yes, thank you for reminding me. Right. Okay, I preface this by saying this is not my idea. I found it when I was researching the topic in the Encyclopedia Judaica. Has a reference to, so dreidel we know very well. Dreidel has 4 sides, and on each side is written a Hebrew letter, Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin. And we know them, and the Maseres is that the Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin stands for Nes Gadol Hayasham. A great miracle happened there. And of course, latterly in Israel, it was written that the Shin was replaced with a Pei, Po here, Nes Gadol Hayah Po. So the Encyclopedia Judaica wants to suggest that actually the makar, the source for these letters on the dreidel, is medieval German gambling dice, which also was spun like this with 4 sides, and on each side there were 4 letters inscribed in, as it were, the English alphabet, N, G, H, and S, which you could easily suggest are connected to Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin. The Nun, the N stands for nisht, or nothing. The Gimel stands for Gantz, everything. The Hey, or the H, stands for halb, which is half, and the Shin was for like put one in. I can't remember the exact language, but the suggestion is that actually possibly the Nun Gimel Hey Shin story that I was told and more in school maybe nothing more than the Hebraization of good old-fashioned medieval German gambling die. I don't want to put anybody off the game. It's great fun, and please don't come out to my house and throw esrogim at me that I'm destroying some of the great fun of Judaism. But you heard it here first. So thank you for your reminder, Aaron.
No, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I think you probably explained this already, but to be honest, my Zoom was breaking here, so I'm not sure. So I may be asking something you already said. You did mention that Halal is not said on Purim, and I think the reason is because the name of God is hidden in the story, isn't it?
So you're absolutely right that we say that in the same way that the name of Hashem is hidden in the Purim story, because the Purim is the whole day of Purim is a holiday of Nes Nistar, of hidden miracles. It all seems to be very sort of coincidental. You're absolutely right. But one could also posit that the reason why there's no Halal, the Gemara tells us there is no Halal, is because the Megillah acts as a Halal. And the Megillah itself is the Halal. The Megillah is the description of the greatness of Hashem in that moment. So you're of course right, but there are multiple facets to that. So I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. Forgive me.
Maybe you did. Maybe I was just breaking on like I said, my connection was breaking. Thank you.
Can I ask about the lighting outside? People in especially Eretz Israel, they light outside in these glass boxes on their front doorsteps. Is that like an additional part of the Chidurim for lighting outside? Because we're told to light near a window, aren't we, to celebrate it? But what about lighting outside?
It's a fair question. So I think the lighting outside is not necessarily a Hidur in the sense of the Gemara telling us what the Hidurim are, but it's certainly true that the best in class performance of Hanukkah menorah lighting is that it's visible to the outside world, and the more visible the better. So therefore, having it directly outdoors, the halacha brings down, you're supposed to have it immediately next to your front door on the outside. obviously, as time developed, many of the Rishonim talk quite depressingly about how, of course, it's impossible to light your candles in the window now because of how dangerous it would be to attract negative attention. But for sure, lighting outside is, if you're talking about Pirsum Hanes, you're talking about explicitly showing the world the light quite figuratively. Doing it outside is the best way of doing it. It is interesting that minhag in Eretz Israel caught on of lighting in boxes, but we hasn't carried over to here, even though, thank God, we live in a Medina Shal Chesed, and certainly I certainly don't hear regularly of people having trouble from lighting menorah. But the minhag has remained to light inside. Thanks. Probably in England because of the rain. So I don't know how rainproof those boxes are. Okay, well, I feel like I've taken enough of all of your weekday evening up. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to get in touch. But I hope you enjoyed the learning, and I wish you all a Freilichen Chanukah.
Thank you very much, Shmueli. Thank you very much. Very interesting share. As you have advertised, next week we will be having a share at 9 o'clock by David Lebrecht on the role of the Apocrypha in Jewish thought. So that's 9 o'clock next Monday, and I hope you can join us for that. And thank you once again, Shmueli.
Thank you, Aaron, for organising.